Wyoming Territory, 1877, the wind carried dust across the high plains. And at the edge of the dry land near Medicine Bow, 22-year-old Fallon Hart stood gripping the fence rail with both hands, watching the last of her brothers disappear in the back of a trader's wagon. She had not cried when they took Micah, nor when he was hauled off 3 weeks after. But now, as 13-year-old Jonah looked back at her with wide, breaking eyes, she felt something inside her snap. "Fallon," he yelled, struggling against the man's grip. "Fallon, please," she lurched forward, but the barrel of her rifle stopped her. Clement Price, the man who called himself the boys' new guardian ever since their father's gambling debts swallowed the family whole, shook his head. "You know the deal," he said, voice dry as the dirt beneath them. "They work until my coin is paid back. You ought to be grateful I left you here to tend the house." Fallon let the silence take her face, but her throat burned. She didn't speak. She hadn't spoken a word to Clement since her father dropped dead in the snow 6 months ago, leaving her alone with her 3 younger brothers and a house with no deed. She watched the wagon turn west, rattle down the rutted road, and disappear behind the rise. Her brothers were gone, one by one. Sold off like cattle, Fallon pressed her forehead to the fence post and let the splinters bite into her skin. She stayed like that long after the dust settled. 3 days later, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. She was chopping wood, sleeves rolled to her elbows, face streaked with sweat and ash. She looked up, hand going to the axe instinctively. A single rider came over the rise, tall and lean on a dapple gray mare. He rode like he belonged to the saddle. Not like Clement's men, who slouched and cursed and drank even while mounted. This one sat straight. Wary, quiet, he slowed as he came toward her, and Fallon narrowed her eyes. "Name's Nash Delling," he said, stopping a few feet out. His voice was low but clear. "I was looking for the Price place." She stared. "What for?" "Business." She dropped the axe into the stump and crossed her arms. "If you're buying, there's nothing left but me. I'm not for sale." Nash looked her over, not in a way that made her skin crawl. He was just taking her in like someone reading a map. His eyes were dark hazel, dusted by the sun, and his face was sharp around the jaw. "I heard about the boys," he said, her stomach turned. "Who told you?" "Man in Elk Hollow. Said Price owed money and paid it off by selling 3 kids to different outfits downriver." Fallon's chest tightened. Nash looked past her to the house. "You alone here?" She nodded once. He dismounted slowly, tying his mare to the fence rail. He moved with calm purpose, nothing wasted. No twitchy fingers, no fast glances. When he straightened, he reached into his coat and pulled something out. It was a folded paper with 3 names written in thick black ink. Micah Hart sold to the Dobry logging camp. Illy Hart sold to Farrow's Grange near Rawlins. Jonah Hart sold to the Claystone quarry near Laramie. "I plan to get them back," Nash said. Fallon blinked. "Why?" He looked right at her. "Because no one else will." She stared at him, heart thudding. "You do not even know them." "No," he said, "but I had a little brother, died in a flood when I was 15. I would have traded anything for 1 more hour with him, even my horse." Fallon felt her breath catch. "Clement will not give you those boys back. He will ask coin, and if you do not have it, he will find a way to ruin you." "I am not giving him coin," Nash said simply. "I am giving him the only thing he ever wanted." He turned and looked at his mare. "She is worth more than silver in these parts, pureblood Mustang. Fast, smart, and Clement's been after her since he saw me ride through 2 years ago. I did not sell her then, I will now." Fallon felt the world tilt. "You would trade your horse for my brother's?" Nash's eyes held hers. "Yes." She did not know what to say. Her throat tightened. Her hands gripped the hem of her apron. "You do not know me," she whispered. "No," he said, "but I know what kind of woman stays behind and chops her own wood after losing everything." She looked down, tears stinging her eyes. "I will bring them back," he said, voice firm. One by one. He came back 1 week later, leading Micah by the hand. The boy was filthy, bruised, but alive. Fallon dropped to her knees and pulled him into her arms, sobbing so hard her chest cracked open. Micah clung to her like he was drowning. Nash stood back, silent. His mare was gone. Fallon looked up at him, her lips parted. "You did it. I told you I would." She rose slowly, wiping her face. "Come inside, eat something." He hesitated, then nodded. That night, as the fire crackled, Fallon laid Micah down in his old bed. She closed the door and turned. Nash stood by the hearth, arms crossed, watching the flames. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once. Fallon stepped closer. "Why are you doing this? Truly," he looked at her then, eyes steady. "Because I do not like watching good people get torn apart." She stepped closer still. "And after you bring back Ellie, Jonah," he hesitated. "Then I suppose I ride home." She looked at him for a long moment. "I hope you do not," she said. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in his face, not surprise, hope. Nash nodded once. "Then I will bring them both back." The second boy came home in the back of a freight wagon, curled under a blanket that barely reached past his knees. Fallon stood on the porch when she spotted the wagon cresting the ridge just past noon, chin lifted against the wind. She knew it was Nash before she saw his face. He was walking beside the wagon this time, not riding. He had no horse now, and his gait was stiff, as if he'd been walking for days without rest. Illy sat propped against a sack of flour, thinner than Fallon remembered, with a cut above his brow and a raw scab on one hand. He didn't speak when he saw her, just blinked fast like he was trying to make sense of her face. Fallon stepped down the porch and met them halfway. "I found him near Rollins," Nash said, voice hoarse from the road. "Pharaoh wasn't keen to part with him, took more than talk." Fallon's arms went around Illy before she could answer. He buried his face in her shoulder, and she felt how light he'd become, not just in weight. In the way he clung to her, not sure whether to believe it was real. Nash waited beside the wagon, dust streaked along his collar and a tear in his coat sleeve. He didn't interrupt. She led Illy inside, settled him on the same straw mattress Micah had taken over, and gave him water with a touch of honey. He drank it in 3 gulps, then lay back without a word. When she came back out, Nash was kneeling beside the well, rinsing blood from his knuckles. She crossed to him, crouched beside the bucket. "Did he fight you?" she asked. He shook his head. "Didn't have to. I offered my rifle and a week's labor at his place, told him I'd cut firewood, fix his roof, whatever he needed. He took it. But the man's got no soul, Fallon. He'd have kept Illy till his back broke if I hadn't stepped in." Fallon dipped a cloth into the water and reached for his hand. "Let me." He didn't flinch when she pressed the cloth to the torn skin. His hands were calloused and broad, but the cuts were deep. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know," she looked up at him. "What kind of man gives up his rifle and bleeds for children he's never met?" He met her eyes, not with pride, but with something steadier. "One who's seen too many mothers bury sons and too many sisters left with nothing." Fallon folded the cloth, pressing it gently. "Do you have family?" "Had a father. He drank himself blind. Ma left before I could remember her. Road trail crews since I was 16. She nodded, then dipped the cloth again. "You'll stay the night." He glanced toward the house. "Your brother needs quiet. There's a cot near the stove. You'll take it." He didn't argue. That night the wind rose hard against the windows, and Fallon sat at the table with a needle and Illy's torn shirt. Nash leaned back in the corner by the fire, eyes half closed but not asleep. Micah had taken to humming low while he whittled something between his knees. Illy lay still, but his breathing had smoothed since morning. Fallon looked up from her stitching. "I'll pay you back." Nash opened his eyes. "I didn't ask for payment. I'll find a way." He straightened, elbows on his knees. "The way you looked at me when I brought Micah back, that was worth more than coin." She set the needle down. "You can't say things like that if you mean to leave." "I haven't left yet." Micah looked up briefly from his whittling, then went back to it. Fallon rose and went to the hearth, standing near him. "Where's Jonah?" "Claystone Quarry," he said. "East of Laramie. It's a hard place. They don't let workers talk much, but I've spoken with a man who runs supplies there. He'll get me in." She nodded. "What will you give this time?" "Doesn't matter." She reached out, touched the edge of his sleeve. "It does to me." He looked at her hand. "I'll bring him back." Her fingers lingered a moment longer, then dropped. "I'll have food for you before dawn," she said. That night, after the fire died low and the boys slept, Fallon lay in her cot listening to the wind scrape at the walls. She thought of Nash out there, walking alone with no horse, no rifle, no coin. Just a name and a promise. In the quiet, she pressed her hand to her chest and closed her eyes. She was afraid, not of losing Jonah, but of what would happen to her if Nash didn't come back. Fallon woke to frost on the windows and the sound of Illy breathing steady beside his brother. She moved quietly through the cabin, layering kindling into the stove and coaxing the fire back to life with careful breath. The kettle took its time warming, and by the time the boys stirred, the sun had only just cut across the edge of the far hill. Nash had left without waking anyone. His coat was gone from the peg, and the heel mark of his boot still showed faint in the dirt outside the door. Fallon stood in it for a while, arms folded, eyes scanning the horizon though there was nothing to see but winter grass and wind. Illy spoke little that morning. He sat close to Micah while they ate, but his shoulders stayed hunched, and his eyes kept drifting toward the window. Fallon didn't press him. She only set another log in the stove and made sure they had enough flour to carry through the week. Later, when the boys went out to gather dried thistle for kindling, she stood in the doorway, watching them work. Micah moved with more confidence now, his hands quick, his stance wider. Illy followed close behind but kept his eyes low, as though waiting for someone to call him back. By sundown, the light turned gold along the ridge and the wind calmed. The boys were quiet after supper, curled near the stove with their heads together. Fallon sat alone at the table, sewing a patch into the hem of her skirt, though her fingers moved without thought. Her mind was in the hills, chasing after a man with no horse and no weapon, walking east toward a quarry that took boys and forgot their names. When the knock came, it was soft but certain. Fallon opened the door to find a stranger on the step. He was broad in the chest and wore a thick wool coat with a tear along one arm. A gray scarf covered the lower half of his face, and snow dusted his shoulders. His eyes were sharp and blue, older than Nash's and cautious. "You Fallon Hart," she nodded, not stepping aside. "Name's Wilgarve. I haul freight through the Laramie line. Saw a man 2 days back asking questions at Claystone. Said he was looking for a boy. Gave a name Jonah Hart." Fallon's breath caught, but she didn't speak. "He took a job unloading carts just to get inside. They don't let anyone near the boys unless they're marked for work. I figured if he was asking after kin, someone ought to know." "Is he?" Her voice came out rough. She swallowed. "Is he hurt?" Didn't look it, but the foreman's taken notice. Place like that, asking too many questions gets a man buried in shale. Fallon stepped back. "Come in, warm yourself." Will shook his head. "Can't, I'm bound north." "Just thought you ought to know someone's looking out." She watched him disappear into the dusk, then closed the door and leaned against it, eyes closed. That night, after the boys were asleep, Fallon sat by the stove with the ledger her father had kept before the debts. The pages were stained and crooked, but she found a blank one near the back and wrote a single line with the stub of a charcoal pencil. "Jonah, he's close. Please come back." She folded the page and tucked it behind a loose stone near the hearth. 3 days passed. The wind turned bitter. Fallon sent the boys out only in short stretches. They worked side by side, no longer asking when Nash would return but glancing east every time the door opened. Fallon kept the stove burning longer than usual and carved strips of old linen into bandages, though no one was bleeding. On the 4th morning, before the sun had cleared the ridge, Fallon heard the latch shift. She rose from her cot, heart racing. The door opened slow, and there he was. Jonah was bundled in a coat too large for him, his face pale under a layer of grime and soot. Nash stood behind him, leaning slightly to one side, his left arm wrapped tight with a bloodied cloth. Fallon didn't speak. She crossed the floor and dropped to her knees, arms around Jonah before the cold had left his skin. He clung to her, trembling. Nash didn't move. She looked up at him, eyes wide. "What happened?" "Stone gave way near the shaft," he said. "I got him clear, but not before it caught my shoulder." She stood, hand touching his uninjured arm. "Come sit down." He didn't argue. She helped him to the cot by the stove. His coat was stiff with dried blood. She cut it away with the kitchen shears, jaw tight. "Does it need stitching?" "Already done." He winced as she peeled back the bandage. "A woman at the supply tent helped me after we got out." Jonah had fallen asleep beside the stove. Micah and Illy hovered near, quiet. Fallon cleaned the wound with hot water and willow bark, then wrapped it fresh. "You have nothing left," she said softly. "I didn't need anything else." Her hands stilled. He looked at her then, not with pain or weariness, but with something deeper. Steady and quiet. "I couldn't keep walking away." She met his gaze. "You don't have to." He reached for her hand. She let him. "Fallon Hart, he said, voice low. I don't want a trail to ride anymore. I want a place to stay. She didn't answer, only leaned in and pressed her forehead to his. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the hearth glowed and the boys slept easy for the first time in months. Nash closed his eyes, her hand still in his, and breathed in the warmth of something he hadn't known he was missing. A home. A woman with fire in her bones. A family stitched back together, one promise at a time. The first thaw came slow. Ice clung to the edges of the stream behind the house, and the ground turned to mud before it softened to soil. Fallon moved through the days with sleeves rolled and skirts mudded, her head full of quiet plans. She had always worked with purpose, but now there was shape to it, rows to plant, repairs to make. A new roofline she traced with her finger each evening while the boys slept. Nash had taken to mending what he could with one good arm, stubborn as a mule about doing his share. He sat on the porch when the sun warmed the boards, carving stakes for the garden or sanding the rough edges off the broken kitchen chairs. Fallon noticed the way his jaw tightened when the wound pulled, but he never asked for help. One evening, after the boys had gone to bed and the light dipped orange through the cottonwoods, Fallon brought out 2 mugs of chicory and sat beside him. The porch creaked under her weight. You never said how long you planned to stay, she said, keeping her eyes on the horizon. I didn't figure it out yet, he answered, voice low. She sipped from her mug. The boys ask if you're staying for good. I told them I didn't know. I've been thinking about that, he said after a pause. There's a freight line hiring near Elk Hollow. They need someone steady. I could ride into town twice a month, bring back what we can't grow. Fallon turned her head to study him. You want to stay? I do. She set the mug down on the step. Then say it plain. He looked at her then, the quiet between them stretching long and full. I want to put down roots, Fallon. Here, with you and the boys. She folded her hands in her lap. I never thought I'd have a choice about what came next, but I want you here. That's plain enough. He reached over, not quick, not uncertain, and placed his hand over hers. The warmth of it settled something in her chest that had been restless too long. They sat like that until the stars came out. That spring, the boys built a fence around a half-acre plot while Fallon turned the earth with a borrowed plow. Nash walked the perimeter most days, checking the boards, teaching Micah to drive in nails with a steady hand. Illy liked to shadow Fallon, asking questions about seeds and soil, quiet but eager. Jonah, still new to freedom, kept close to the house, but he started to smile more when no one was watching. One afternoon, Nash returned from the creek with his shirt damp and a string of fish slung over one shoulder. He found Fallon kneeling in the garden. Her hands were stained with loam, a streak of dirt across her cheek. Thought you might want these, he said, setting the fish down beside her. She looked up, shading her eyes. That's enough for supper and then some. I'll clean them. You've done plenty. She rose, brushing her hands against her skirt. You're not one to rest, are you? I don't know how to, not yet. She studied him a moment. You ever had a place that was yours? He shook his head. Never stayed long enough anywhere for that. Well, she said, you do now. He stepped closer. You sure? I wouldn't say it if I wasn't. He reached up, brushing the dirt from her cheek with the back of his fingers. Her breath caught, but she didn't move. I've never had anyone look at me like I was worth keeping, he said. She placed her palm against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath. You brought my family back. You didn't just bring them, you stayed. He leaned in then, slow with the weight of it, and kissed her like he already belonged. They stood in the garden, dusk curling around them, the sound of frogs rising from the creek. Inside, the boys' laughter echoed through the walls and the fire crackled low. Later that night, Fallon curled beneath the quilt, Nash beside her. His arm draped over her waist, the steady rise and fall of his breath warm against her neck. The cabin no longer felt like a place holding its breath, it breathed with them now. They had no riches, no certainty beyond the next frost, but they had each other, and they had earned this peace. They would build a life out of it, one morning at a time. The summer settled over the land with a hush, warm and slow. The air carried the scent of sage and creek stone, and the fields behind the house filled with the sound of insects humming low in the grass. The garden grew steady under Fallon's hand, beans curling up their poles, squash spreading thick leaves across the dark soil. The boys took to their chores with a kind of quiet pride, each of them changed in some small way stronger, more certain. They didn't speak much of where they'd been, but they no longer looked over their shoulders when they laughed. One morning, Fallon stood at the edge of the fence, watching Jonah and Micah haul water from the creek. Their laughter drifted up toward her on the breeze, light and real. She rested a hand on her belly, where a subtle heaviness had begun to bloom. She hadn't spoken of it, yet not aloud, but she felt it in the way her body had shifted, in the way her breath caught when the sun hit just right. She turned as Nash came up the path, his shirt damp with sweat, sleeves rolled past his elbows. He carried a short-handled hoe and a pair of bent nails in his pocket, having just finished tacking down the last of the chicken wire fencing behind the shed. His stride was even now, his shoulder long-heeled, though the scar still drew a pale line beneath his shirt. "You're watching them like they might float off," he said, setting the tool against the porch rail. "They were ghosts once," she murmured. "Now they're boys again," he nodded, then reached for her hand. His thumb brushed her wrist, careful. "You've been quiet," he said. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes followed the younger boys as they dropped the bucket and splashed knee-deep into the creek, careless with their joy. "There's something," she said finally, "but I wanted to be certain before I told you." He turned toward her fully, brows drawn. "I'm with child," she said, voice steady, not far along but enough to know. For a moment he didn't speak. Then his hand slid from hers to her waist, slow and reverent, as though he'd never touched her there before. "You sure?" "I am," he exhaled, and the sound was something between wonder and disbelief. "I didn't think I'd have a family again," he said. "Not like this. Not with hope in it." Fallon leaned into him, her head against his shoulder. "We've made something here, something real." He kissed the top of her head, his hands resting on her hips. "You've given me more than I ever thought I'd have." They stood like that while the wind tugged gently at the hem of her skirt, and the boys' shouts echoed from the water. Later that week, Nash rode into Elk Hollow with a freight convoy, returning with flour, seed, and a small wooden cradle he'd traded for carved with thistles along the side, its rockers smooth and worn by time. He set it by the hearth without a word. Fallon saw it and let her hand rest on the rim, her expression unreadable for a long moment. Then she turned to him and reached for his hand. "I want to marry you," she said, not waiting for him to ask. He smiled, slow and sure. "I was hoping you would." They married on a clear morning in late August, beneath the cottonwoods by the creek. The reverend from town came out in a borrowed wagon, and the boys wore shirts Fallon had stitched from muslin and patience. Micah held the ring, wrapped in a square of cloth. Illy read a verse from the book their mother had once kept by her bed. Jonah stood tall beside Nash, his face solemn with pride. Fallon wore a dress the color of river clay with a ribbon tied at her waist. Her hair was braided down her back, streaked with strands of sun. Nash wore his cleanest trousers and the coat she'd mended in the spring. When she said his name aloud, Nash Delling, her voice didn't tremble. When he said hers, Fallon Hart, his fingers were steady as they closed around hers. Afterward, they shared bread and dried apples on the porch while the boys chased each other through the grass. The sun hung low, and the sky turned the color of warm cream. That night, Fallon lay with her head on his chest, his hand cradling the curve of her belly. The house was quiet around them, the air thick with summer heat and the scent of wood smoke. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. "Sometimes." "What do you see?" He turned his head to look at her, the candlelight catching the faint line at the corner of his eye. "I see you," he said. "I see a child with your eyes and my stubbornness. I see the boys grown tall. I see a home that never forgets what it costs to be whole." She closed her eyes, her fingers laced with his. "That's what I see too." They slept like that, wound into each other, not needing more than the soft creak of the rafters and the promise of morning. Seasons passed. The child came in the early winter, a girl with dark hair and Fallon's quiet mouth. They named her Clara, after the stream that ran behind the house. Nash held her like she was made of breath. The boys took turns rocking her, their hands too big for her tiny fists. Fallon healed slow but strong. The cradle sat near the stove, worn smooth from use. Nash built a second one by hand for when she outgrew it, plainer, but made with care. He carved a line of small birds along the edge, one for each of them. By the time the next spring came, the homestead had taken on a rhythm, the sound of water against stone, chickens in the yard, boots on porch steps. Neighbors came more often now, drawn by word of a place where kindness had taken root. No one asked how it had all begun. But those who stayed long enough saw it in the way Fallon reached for Nash's hand without looking, in the way he watched her when she moved through the garden, in the way the children's laughter filled every inch of the quiet. And so the story held. A woman who had lost everything but never bent. A man who had nothing and brought back what mattered most. And the family they built, not from blood alone, but from choice and the steadiness of two hands meeting again and again, through every season that followed.